yeah, this is a storytelling session where me and Tom are kind of going to share both our stories and also how they interweave, and with that, kind of how our work interweaves. Tom's work on working with source, and mine with masculine and feminine leadership. So I'm just going to dive right into the story, yeah, and like Tom said, you can post questions in the chat. We're just going to kind of let this session and see what questions and things emerge from the story we share. So I guess one way of saying how this story started was when I was in uni. I founded 2 organizations. And I, without knowing that was what it was then, because this was before reinventing organizations and everything, I did some attempts at doing decentralized organizing, just from the feeling of like there must be better ways of organizing than the ones I knew of. I went to Art of Hosting and like cried for a whole weekend, and was introduced to collective intelligence and like the idea of complex adaptive systems, and just this feeling of people in work just being so much more in touch with their passions and their, I don't know, deeper parts of themselves, and was just really, really blown away. And then I dug deeper into it, did my master's thesis on like adult development, consciousness development. So my thesis was called Facilitating Consciousness Development, and I dived deep into Keegan and spiral dynamics and Torbert. And I think about like 1 year after I had graduated, Reinventing Organizations came out, and I was really really amazed by how this book kind of so elegantly put words to things that I've been exploring. So I was one of the first like super nerdy people on this online forum, this discourse forum on the book when it first came out. And I posted, asked for help around some issues I was having with one of the organizations that I had founded, World Values Initiative. And Tom answered, gave some perspectives on this issue that also really blew my mind. And this was about 8 years ago, and he introduced me to this perspective of source. And do you want to comment, Tom?
Shall I pick it up a little bit there? Yeah. So some of what I saw in Fanny's story, and when she posted on the Reinventing Organizations forum, was some common problems that we see in these modern, very decentralized, sort of progressive, very collectivist initiatives. And that is the denial that underneath all of this organization stuff, there's a creative initiative. There's a creative process of trying to bring something new into the world underneath it all. We get so fixated on organizations that we somehow lose sight of the fact that underneath it is creativity. And in the story that Fanny shared, it seemed to really speak to this. And in particular, and this is sometimes like heresy to people in the Teal world, and maybe half the people will drop off the call when I say this, is that in any human initiative to realize some kind of idea in the world or to make a change in the world, you can find exactly one individual in a naturally emergent, different, special role with a special connection to that creative process. And it's what my great friend and teacher Peter Koenig called the role of source. And what seemed to be going on in this initiative that Fanny was describing were what I would call source issues. So there weren't actually any problems that were ultimately organizational problems, but there was a problem around who was holding the vision for this thing that they were all working so hard to bring into the world. So that was a thing that I'd been I was relatively new on my journey with that, actually. I learned about Peter's source principles probably 10 years ago now. So this was only about a year into that journey. So I was still finding my way with it. And Fanny and I, made this connection, found some resonance with that work. But maybe if I go back to you, Fanny, you can say a bit more about, to sort of unpack what was going on maybe in that situation and how you made sense of it. What do you think?
It was a student organization called World Values Initiative, and actually the kind of idea of the organization was to create a space to support students with personal development, and a lot based on like consciousness development, on self-leadership, basically. I had the idea for an initiative together with a friend, and then we kind of joined forces with a larger, and we were going to call that, it doesn't really matter, but our management program was called Technology Management, and we were going to call it Technology Management Impact, because I was tired that all the management students were only like focusing on themselves and their own career, and we were like, but we're getting so many amazing tools around management and leadership, we want to spread it with the rest of the school. But then we got connected with some other students who were doing similar things at another university under the name World Values Initiative, and we decided to kind of join forces and also call ourselves World Values Initiative. But it was really unclear kind of who was the one who started World Values Initiative and why, and it just led to all these tensions. People wanting different things, basically. And Tom gave the perspective of this source, and it made it it just made so much sense, and I could see how. I don't know if I have to go into the details, but there was kind of an organization above supporting that, where I think there was also source issues kind of in that organization. That was, oh, somebody was just not unmuted. That was kind of like.
So at this point, we have 2 times.
We need some help to mute whoever is got this background noise.
It seems that there's a person called Dora who needs to mute themselves.
Done.
There we go. Thank you. Was I muted as well for some of it?
No, you're all good, Fanny.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, that was what was going on, and it just, to me, it gave this idea that like Teal is really to transcend and include, and to me the source perspective was something about including what works really well in kind of, if you would call it, previous paradigms, and bringing in the more collectivistic approach. So this thing of like being top down and bottom up at the same time.
Yeah, and I'm wondering whether to just go into this relationship between the source paradigm from Peter Koenig and then the Teal paradigm from Frederick Laloux, because it was really interesting in that time around 2014-15 when everyone was really getting excited about Teal organizations, and I was writing at the time a lot about the role of source from Peter's perspective, and it made a lot of people really angry at the time, which I found really fascinating, and we can go into that in a little moment. But then the really fun thing that happened is eventually Peter and Frederick, that they were actually really great friends and actually found far more commonality between what they believed about how we organize than they did differences. But interestingly, a lot of followers of Frederick that really didn't like it. So there was something really interesting going on there. But one perspective that I'd like to share with you is when we think from the Teal paradigm, we often talk about orange organizations, green organizations, teal organizations, and we're trying to reinvent our organizations. And you'll notice how the sort of the common denominator there is it's all about organizations. And so in a way, that's still the paradigm. We're still in this paradigm of thinking that organizations are things, and an organization could be a particular type of organization. And we think about different ways of establishing what the purpose of the organization is. And actually, part of the reason why I think Peter Koenig's source principles help us go in some ways beyond the Teal paradigm is we actually break out of this fixation on organizations altogether, which goes right back to what I said at the start, is that whenever humans are working together, underneath all of this organizational stuff that us organizational geeks can get really interested in and excited about, there's just a process of pure creativity, of some kind of idea coming into the world. And as I noted before, that Peter noticed from his own observations over many years, that you find one individual, almost like the main artist, who's at the heart of any creative process. And this includes in any initiative that you might describe as a Teal organization. If you look carefully, underneath all of this collectivism, you might find that you can identify the one individual person who has this natural authorship over the creative vision that's being created. And the reason that that makes people angry in the Teal world is because there's this belief, which I think actually is quite an ideological belief rather than something that's rooted in the sort of the evidence we see in front of us, that we like the idea of something being 100% decentralized, that there's no special one individual, and certainly not someone in a role where it just emerged naturally. They weren't even voted in, you know, using some democratic process. So that can be, you know, quite challenging for some people to get their heads around. But if you just start to look at the evidence that you've read and maybe that you've experienced yourself, and certainly my experience of reading Reinventing Organizations is during the first two parts of the book about wholeness and self-management, the book was absolutely alive with the stories of these sources who'd created these incredible cultures and incredible initiatives that were doing amazing work in the world and drawing people in. You know, it's the Jos de Bloks, it's the Jean-François Zobrists, Yvon Chouinard, and so on and so on. And so it's a bit of an odd denial to say, actually, it's not important who the founder was. They're just another person in the ecosystem. So there's quite a big paradigm shift there to think a little bit differently. And I think part of what's going on, and you know, and I'd be curious whether you guys agree, maybe you can write in the chats if you agree with this or not, is that I think what's going on is many people in this Reinventing Organizations and Teal world are sort of survivors and people who are quite survivors of and people who stand against the orange organizational paradigm, this kind of bad individual centered industrial top-down management style of organizing. And that's certainly been my experience. There's a lot of people who've been wounded by those kind of the toxic elements of those kind of environments. And there's this wish, there's this longing for something that doesn't have any hierarchy, that's where top down is gone and it's all about bottom up and emergence. And actually what happens is people swing too far the other way. Whereas actually, if we're really, from a developmental perspective, trying to reach something higher, as I'm sure everyone here, you know, knows in theory at least, we transcend and include. And Fanny mentioned this earlier. And so we need to be able to say there are elements that we really love about the orange paradigm as well, and that we can love about there being a top-down leader. But it's not about a regression back to that. It's saying that can coexist along with the very best techniques and approaches in collective intelligence, collectivism, decentralization as well. And so this is the sort of the movement that Fanny and I are part of, is really getting away from this idea that, yeah, top down is old school and bad, decentralization is modern and good. And sometimes being radically both top down and bottom up and outside in and inside out at the same time, and doing that artfully. And we'll get into some of the more specific ways that that might come to light. But that's a little bit more for you. I'm wondering whether to hear from one or two people in the audience, or is there anything that you want to say right now, Fanny? I'm curious what questions or reflections are popping for people. Maybe Romek, you can help us sort of navigate it.
Well, I had an impulse to share something myself. I really like what you're saying, both of you, and I've come across this view that decentralization and centralization are actually polarities that never go away. I wonder if you find that what you think of that.
Yes,
And that's a helpful perspective.
Yeah, I find that really helpful, and I think so often in this work we're dealing with polarities. But the really interesting thing is if you're a person who has an idea for something you want to bring into the world that might manifest as, say, some sort of company or non-profit, and you take some steps to start to realize that idea, and you realize that as more people join, you can't just organize in a bureaucratic hierarchy, because that's going to slow everything down. There's going to be too much power over people and all of those downsides of the top-down model that we know about. So you might say, right, we want to create something really inspired by Teal organizations, making the best of self-management, collective intelligence, and so on and so on. But the interesting thing is if that's part of the vision, that in itself needs to be held. So there is something top down there to say there's a way and a thing that we're doing and a way that we're not doing this thing. So you have to hold in a top down way the space for emergence to work really well. Because when there is only emergence and sort of bottom up, things can work certainly for a time for a while, but they can also be prone to collapse. And some of the other systemic problems you see with totally decentralized systems, such as the global financial system, for example, where they can actually become incredibly unstable. So yeah, so even if the vision is for participation, that is still a vision, and it really helps if someone is holding that. And interestingly, you know, if you look at the Reinventing Organizations book, there were two examples of organizations that kind of regressed to something a bit more primitive from their more Teal-y way of doing things. And in both instances, it was where the individual who was the source had left or allowed themselves to be forced out. So even in the book, there is some evidence of this. So yeah, thank you, Romek. And let's maybe keep it going with a few more questions. I like it.
Yeah, I'm noticing Peter and Elias having raised their hands. Perhaps you could just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Looks
and
like Peter's
there were a couple of people in the chat that I would mention in a moment.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, one thing I've been noticing is that a lot of the examples of organizations you know, have not decided that, okay, I'm going to be Teal, or this is the better way to be, or I want to evolve into. It was a sort of a need. It was a sort of survival need. It wasn't kind of necessarily even a sort of a bet. And I think the two that come to mind, and I keep noticing them, I think I was struck by Semler when he spoke about, you know, our organization is going to die unless we think of another way of doing this. It wasn't a sort of a nice theory and let's see how we can move into kind of wholeness and whatnot. It was the after fact that, you know, they came along and looked at some of the commonalities. It was a question of survival. And I think I was also listening into the conversation with Roche as well. They'd tried everything. And this was now, again, it was a need. And so I suppose if this is a question, it's understanding when do we move in? Is it really based on, well, you have no other option, move in, or is it, I would like to have a much better working environment and business? I mean, I'm hearing that as well. So sorry, that wasn't a very clear question, but
it was a really nice addition, though, and I think that's really true that not everyone sets out to create a Teal organization, nor should they. And in the same way, many of us who discovered working with Source and Peter's work had gone really deep in the ideas around more decentralized forms of management. You know, I remember reading Semler's iconic book Maverick in about 2002 or 2003, and it was like, this is how business should be. But then it was through the journey of actually realizing that it's, you know, sometimes the creative juice can get sucked out of something when you try to let go of all authority. And I gave Otti a hell yes in the chat when he mentioned that word authority, because authority gets a really bad rap, doesn't it? People think, we need less authority. But, you know, the way I've learned to think about this, and I think this was from my good friend Charles Davis, you know, once said that the root of the word authority is the same as the root of the word author. So it's like authority as in authorship. And when we think about it like that, again, that gets us back out of this organizational mindset and back into a mode where we're thinking about creativity. So you think like, who is the authority on a subject? So the authority is the person who authored the book about it, the person who is the go-to person for it. And so, you know, I think, you know, in the industrial paradigm, we got very fixated on formal authority, like who has power over who to tell people to do things or to stop do things and so on. But we can lose sight of the really useful creative nature of authority as in authorship. Is there anything you want to add, Fanny?
Yeah, as I really resonate with that thing, that I really think the most successful Teal endeavors have never read Reinventing Organizations or don't know that they're Teal, you know, like it's coming out of need, because this is the thing, like self-organization is it's highly complex thing, and you can't design it with your mind. You just can't. And this is, you know, we really want to, as humans, we would love to be able to control nature and to be really super smart with our minds and to be able to design things. And this is where it's so brilliant with the source perspective, that it's not about creating the best organization. It's about having a need and just being so dedicated to fulfilling that need in the world that you'll bring in the people and the processes and the things and keep checking, is this filling the need? Yes, no. And if you don't have that clear need in the center, that clear, I don't want to use the word vision because it's so watered out and means so many different things in this, but like this clear calling to create something, then you're never, like, then you're lost. Like that's the guidance that needs to be in the middle. And just as Tom was saying, like if you just look at evidence not being ideological, it just always seems that channel is coming through one person. And that doesn't mean that person is a dictator that, you know, should tell everybody what to do, but it does mean that person is the one who knows what is in and what is out and what is actually fulfilling this need or not. So I think, yeah, the fact that it is so, that it seems that the people who just do it out of necessity because it is what helps them realize their vision the best are the most successful Teal practitioners, kind of, yeah, gets that to that point.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think, again, that although sort of Teal was supposedly like sort of a new paradigm of organizations, whereas actually the source principles that Peter kind of helped to articulate are basically timeless. And many people who get introduced to this say, oh, this is a bit like something from this spiritual tradition that's 2000 years old. There's just something timeless about the way people create and come together to realize ideas in the world. So there's actually nothing new here. So we're not sort of trying to create a new wave of a new paradigm in management, but we're actually sort of saying that the paradigm was always there, but now what we can do is be more explicit about it. And that was Peter's sort of great contribution, was to put some words to it and help clarify it so we can do it a bit more consciously. But anyway, let's go to some more questions. Elias, you've had your hand up for a while, so let's go to you. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again, and nice to meet you, Fanny. I wanted to share that I read Fanny's article a week ago, something, it was really enlightening. And the question, I'm going through the Peter Koenig's masterclass right now, and I co-founded a company with three other people. And going through the process, I wouldn't be able to name who would be the source, especially between a pair, someone else and myself. Going through the process, I realized that I would be the source of the initiative. And it was a really powerful feeling. Like I already had a lot of love for everyone in the initiative, but it was like just growing. But where I want to go is also just to name a little bit about my background. I'm coming from the team sports area, and I lived in. I've been European champion in a team in which we didn't have a coach, so it was like self-organized. But nobody said let's be self-organized. Just the coach wouldn't come, and we had to organize everything ourselves. And so I was challenging this concept of source. And what is now coming to my mind, and is, okay, I completely feel, and Fanny put words with her feminine, masculine energies and creativity, because if I look at the pair I'm mentioning in my own experience, I would be more connected to the feeling of the life of the initiative, and Fabrice, the other guy, he would just do it. And so for me, it was hard at the very beginning to think, okay, I'm the source of that, because he's just doing everything, you know, I'm just there. And so it was really powerful to read that, your words. And then there is another, so one question I have, and I want to challenge that with all the practitioners and people looking at the source, and Peter himself, is because is there always, well, for me, there's, if I look at situation and ask people, there's always a pair that makes it possible. And if I look at my own situation, I see it in 2 dimensions. Fabrice, because he wouldn't be there, just it wouldn't exist. I could be as much as I would like to be. The initiative wouldn't exist. And also the presence of my wife in my life, because actually creating this initiative happened right after that she came to live in this studio in Paris, so like a really small place. And this is one of the most challenging time of my life. Every time my energy was bad or low, she wouldn't accept. and she's completely invisible in all the organization. Nobody knows that, but I know it. And I know that without her being there and Fabrice being there, it just wouldn't be possible to. And so, well, this is I want to share that, and also I'm really curious on how you came to this observation, Fanny, and I think it can bring, because I completely agree on there is always one person at the start of everything, but this can be a dance and switch and be in multi-dimension. How you came to this observation, and how do you see the impact of bring more consciousness on this creative feminine? And maybe talk a little bit about this creative feminine that you talk so nicely about in your article. I think it would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, lay it out, Fanny.
Yeah, I'm feeling drawn to like dive in to answer your question, but I think it's for everybody else for it to make sense. I might have to backtrack a bit. Yeah, so to me, like I've been interested in decentralized organizing since I was really young, and working with Source was like one of the first, like, wow, like I think this is like a missing thing that we need to kind of integrate to be able to do this big scale. And the second thing was I took a course called Awakening Feminine Leadership by Louise Alsen, and really had an awakening into my feminine. And at the time, I didn't understand, or I didn't like, you know, have a intellectual idea of like why it was so important, but I just felt it in my whole body. Like this is, you know, with everybody trying to do this kind of decentralized way, this is really something important and often lacking. And I'm going to try to keep it a bit brief, but one thing I realized, like I hadn't thought about the polarity between the feminine and masculine at all. Like it didn't feel like a relevant thing for me to think about. And also maybe I was a bit put off by it. And I think I realized one reason I was put off by it is that we have such a shallow description of these polarities in our culture. And when it comes to the masculine, we talk about the masculine a lot as maybe this kind of orange, you know, like the driven, the passionate, getting things done. But what I realize is that there's also like a really strong polarity in the masculine that I call the holding masculine, that is kind of the energy of like a tree or something, a mountain, something really grounded. And these two are like both very masculine, but very different. And when it comes to the feminine, we say that that the feminine, we talk about it as like soft, nurturing, receiving, caring, and this is true. But the feminine is very cyclical, and the cycle starts in what I call the creating feminine, and this is the feminine that embodies the life force, that like is the creative energy. It's the wild feminine, it's the seductress, it's the witch, it's the like feminine that connects us to to life force, that open up life. And from a source perspective, this creative feminine is like the spark, the initiative, the inspiration to everything we create. And that I saw that, and you asked how I came to this conclusion. Like, I mean, I read a lot of stuff, but it was just mostly an experience. Like when I started to step into this creating feminine, what I saw that it pulled, I'm going to say men and women, and it doesn't have to be men and women, but it's just easier. So it pulled men back from, like, especially in the business world, back from being in this like super creating masculine to like, and start holding space and like, me and Tom did this amazing work with the CEO together, where we really did this, took in both the source perspective and this creating feminine, and yeah, pull men back. And what happens then is that when the creating feminine meets the holding masculine, when they two meet, then like direction is created that is really a direction that is really tapped into kind of what wants to come alive. And with this direction, the creating masculine can then go and execute on this, without becoming toxic and without, you know, extracting from the earth, but just really in like honorable direction of what wants to come alive. And the holding feminine is like kind of in polarity with the creating masculine there to keep like the integration and keep the thing together and keep the people together, and also to know when it's done, to bring it back to the cycle again, because the masculine is linear and just wants to keep going, and the holding feminine has a really important role of going back. So that's and then like to touch on your question of like that kind of, so you had trouble taking in source because I couldn't do it myself. And that's like, of course, you know, like source is not about a one-man show. It's actually paradoxically completely the opposite, of like, but the only, and you can source from either of any of these four energies. It's not about, but the only thing is like, who is helping who? You know, like the source is the one who has the vulnerable, goes out in the world and says like, I have this need. I want to bring people together to fulfill this need. And that's the source. And then like, you know, if you're very strongly in the holding feminine, you're going to need all the four other to be able to do that. But yeah, so, and this is what is so beautiful about it, that it's, it almost makes it more collective to bring in the individualistic perspective of source in a way. And I think those like really double bottomed paradoxes are like the gold of really trying to live this artfully. That was long.
No, it was great. And then maybe just to tie it back to source again, and then we'll take some more questions, because I know there are people who've been patiently waiting. But just to share sort of a big aha moment that kind of, you know, Fanny, well, I think she had the aha moment and then shared it with me, and I was also in aha mode. But when I was writing a book about how to work with source, to try to sort of help people answer the question, okay, so if I'm the source, what is it that I'm supposed to actually do, you know, when I find myself in this naturally emergent creative role? So what I try to do is put it into a picture. So I called this the source compass. And essentially what the source is doing is navigating these two big tensions, creative tensions that you face between, on the one hand, this top-down aspect of having to guard the edge of the initiative, what's in and what's out, and on the other hand, being able to let go for bottom-up emergence to happen. And this goes back to what we said earlier about polarities, being able to do both when it's appropriate and needed. And then going the other way, it's this polarity between clarity and doubt. So when you're in any creative process, and in fact, what Peter Koenig reassuringly said is the chronic state of a source is doubt, not knowing what's in and what's out, and not knowing what the next step is, but staying with that not knowing that the clarity eventually comes to them as the source. And then when the clarity comes to them, they're back into that process of authoring the vision, actually, you know, writing the story, making the thing happen in the world. And then just to add to this again, it's the same picture, but just with these 4 behaviors in the corners. So the number one job of a source is listening internally to what their own creative impulse is, what the world is asking for from them as well. It's about hosting. So that's where the role of collective intelligence comes in, to bring people together, to make sure a process is being hosted, to foster that bottom-up emergence. Then sharing source, by allowing other people to step into the source's field, to take responsibility for parts of the vision. We sometimes call those people sub-sources or specific sources. And then also it's to decide and take action. So when the source gets clear, like we're going this way or that way, for that clarity to come to them and make a decision. So this is what a source is trying to do. And often they need a lot of help from this. So they need to make sure these things happen, but they often need a lot of help. And then the penny dropped one day when Fanny said to me, I think what you've described here is the missing holding masculine that's so often missing. Like the masculine energy we've got is all about getting out there, building, selling, charging ahead. And we're missing this holding aspect of the listening, hosting, sharing, but then doing that in service of the creating feminine. So there's like this sort of creative relationship between these different aspects of the masculine and the feminine. And as James, and I were just discussing in the chat, there's a huge importance as well for people who, there's the smaller but really important number of people who don't fit into the binary, who don't just see themselves as, oh, I just rest solely in the masculine or the feminine. Probably most of us do, but huge numbers of us don't. And those people can go between these worlds and have historically, since ancient times, played an important part until they was, often suppressed by more modern cultures. But anyway, yeah, this was a glimpse of how our worlds came together, building on the sort of the Fanny and Tom story. And so this is what we're really working on, is bringing in this aspect of the masculine and feminine and the source work into how we can create creative initiatives that realize the things that the world needs. So that was a very fast whistle-stop tour, and I'll be impressed if anyone understood 100% of that. But if you've got a bit of a flavor for it and it's piqued your interest and it's helping you to see things through a slightly different lens, then that might be a good start. So I think I'll pause for breath there and let's go for some more questions. What do you think, Romek? Who's had their hand up for the longest? Let's get to some of these people.
Well, I think Zoom shows it in the right sequence, like Otti, Claire, and Bianca is who I see.
Correct.
And there were a couple of things in the chat that I'd like to perhaps mention after the three of you have had your turn.
Sure.
Maybe do you want to speak up?
Romek, are you talking to me?
Yes.
Right. Okay,
Yes.
Super. Wow, boy, you took us on the ride. Firstly, thanks for that. Great to see you. And Tom, I got your book here, so you've been on a headache for me for a while. So it's lovely to see it. I mean it in a very nice way. Two things before I forget that came up, Fanny, whilst you were speaking. One might be interesting for people. Goddess Luminary by Lynn Sedgmore. I found it in the feminist writing about leadership one of the most inspiring works, and she picks up some of the things that you mentioned, Fanny, which might be interesting. The other thing that I wanted to point to is, of course, the good old Robert Moore on King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, because I think what Moore describes very nicely is that the Jungian archetypes, of course, have to be understood as part of an individuation journey. So I think the net description of female, feminine is the holding, masculine is the pushing, that's only in the immature archetype, right? So if we go to the rich masculine archetype, the king archetype or the queen archetype, actually you would have individuation, animus and anima come together, which I think is interesting here, because what you describe as the Genesis myth, of course, from a mythological perspective, is Prometheus. Prometheus brings fire, which is eros, which is generativity into the world. And Freud links his archetype to this creativity myth. And where you are creating headaches for me, Tom, to degrees, you talk about source, we talk about spirit, and we talk about the teleological notion of spirit from an ethical perspective. So spirit is telos, is the essence. That is not only eros, if I stay, Fanny, in your picture, it's also thanatos. It's also the death drive, which is about immortality. So it's a qualification of the creative energy in such a way that the ethical aspects come into it. So it's not just about being creative, it's about being good. And this is where the metaphysical dimension comes in, which I did not spot in Peter's work, which is what is creating me headaches, because I could be very creative in creating the next nuclear bomb. That wouldn't be a positive essence. And this is where our work goes to virtue ethics in describing telos more as a qualified eros, if you want. So agape in the notion of charity in the religious, or agape in the Socratesian, whatever that is, becomes the drive. But where I wanted to go, what a fascinating, you blew my mind. Sorry.
There's so much there.
I have one question though, which is, so I was thinking about this stepping into source that you described so nicely in your book, and was trying to transform it into our spirit related work. And then I was thinking about decision making and task allocation. And we've been working with Ted Rao and James Priest and so on sociocracy. And I think that is very nicely combinable with the principle of source, right? So you would make the objections in a sociocratic governance dependent on being close to the source. But I wonder what your thoughts are on task allocation and resource allocation. Is in your mind, is there a principle to say, as a business, we should actually be looking out for the source spots? Let's assume that's not just the founder, it's other people stepping into the source. And shouldn't we have a resource allocation principle which puts resources, people, and money behind the brightest sources? Yeah. So shouldn't we create a more generative, go away from hierarchy? This is not about self-management, autonomy for everybody. No, it's about let's spot the source and let's bring light into the organization. But that requires a different governance mechanism for me. That's where my mind is.
Oh, there was so much there. We started with the big picture, archetypology and everything. And yeah, Fanny and I have been having some amazing conversations with some other colleagues about these topics that you're touching on. So it's a shame we don't have much time to geek out on it. But really practically, one of the examples that I really love that actually brings together the source work and is a case study in reinventing organizations is W.L. Gore Associates. So if you think about, they talk about the model of leadership by followership at Gore, and there are the stories there of how, anyone can start a new initiative and it flies if other people choose to follow it. And if you look at that from a source perspective, what they've done there, and Bill Gore's genius is he created this sort of playground for inventors. So if you're an inventor, it's an amazing place to work. And what's happening there is they're basically allowing people to be specific sources, to have a more specific idea that fits within the overall field of what Gore is trying to do, which is generally around materials, but it's pretty broad. And people have the freedom to play and to source their own ideas. And then people, based on their own impulses, are drawn to one another. They choose to step in or out of each other's initiatives, and an initiative that nobody supports won't go anywhere. So they've almost created this very natural way of working with source. So it's a different perspective. So it's happening in all kinds of places. Yeah, including some of the case studies that we look at, probably at Hire as well, which is a sort of a more recent, since Fred's book came out, more recent example that everyone's interested in. There's the opportunity for people to be micro entrepreneurs. So you can say, there's an opportunity to be a source there, to spot something that you could do that would be useful, that fits within what Hire's doing, but actually you're the source of that specific thing. So I think this, leads to some really interesting ways of allowing for this emergence, but at the same time, not making it just this complete free-for-all. So there still has to be an edge, maybe for Hire, it's saying, so long as you're talking about consumer appliances, that's okay. But maybe people can't invent, I don't know, new coffee mugs or something like that. I'm not sure what the edge is for them. But that's where you have to do both, because I think there's a trap. I've called it creative entropy, when through this desire to allow emergence, you end up just allowing anyone to do anything. And it's much easier for people to start initiatives because they're energized to do it than it is to kill initiatives because they don't really fit and are pulling us in too many directions. And so things start to just dissipate and get diluted or pulled apart in 1,000 directions. So that's again why we need this this real top-down aspect of holding the whole field, whilst within that you can create the bottom-up emergence. And I think where you see examples of that happening, I think that's where you see amazing, innovation, creativity, happy people doing the work of their lives, having the time of their life. So that's one example. But maybe
I'm a little bit aware of time. It would be nice if Claire and Bianca still got a chance to ask their question, because they've been really waiting a long time.
Perfect. Let's do at least those two. Who was first? Claire. Hey, Claire.
Yeah. Hi, Tom. Hi, Fanny, and everyone. I love your book, and I give it to founders who are sort of struggling to understand their role sometimes. So it's a really beautiful book, and thank you very much. But my question has morphed as people have been talking, but it's sort of really what is the source of source, and how much where we are in our life's journey or our understanding or our spiral dynamics place in the world, how that influences how we bring it into the world, how we recognize it, and how we then express it and recognize what's worth doing. And it's sort of like, I sort of put it in earlier, are we then the creators, or are we co-creating with a higher impulse, or are we agents for it? And I don't know if it's even an answer, if there can be answered, but Otti is very philosophical and fantastic how he expressed it. So this, I think, might be expressing it in a more sort of layman's way, perhaps a lay woman, lay human. Anyway,
do you want to take this one first, Fanny?
Yeah, I mean, this is a deeply spiritual question, of course, and like if your question was like, does our relationship to how open we are to this creative energy, whatever it is, affect how we're sourcing? And I definitely say yes. And I think that's such an interesting, somebody asked me earlier in the chat, like, what was your biggest resistance to taking in source? And my biggest resistance was owning like how I had been fucking up the organizations that I was sourcing because of my own shit. Like that was oh fuck. And to me it's like, it's a deep spiritual surrender. Like from a feminine perspective, from the feminine, the surrender is surrendering into daring to be the life force, to daring to be this creative energy and daring to be seen there. And for the masculine, it's daring to surrender in that you're not in control and that you are in service of this energy, and that it's up to you to take initiative, even if you don't know, because otherwise nothing will happen. And kind of the inner work, or the more we can surrender and tap into that, the more creative. And as I think was Odi was saying, like, of course it's not about me. For me, the definition of creativity is life affirming and constructive. But of course, things are creative. Yeah, I mean, it also depends on your definition of creativity.
Yeah, really well put. And I would just add to that. I think this question of like, what's the source of source, and where does it come from? And it is, as Fanny said, it's a spiritual answer. And I'm just thinking about, like, it's really cool to have Hideaki here, one of my great friends in Japan, who's one of the translators of Work with Source into Japanese, who's been a dream to work with. We did a whole bunch of things in Japan last year, and it's really interesting hearing the spiritual answers to that question from different people. Sometimes when you say, well, if you're the source, where's it coming from? They sometimes look up to the heavens. Maybe they say it comes from God. The Junkan community guys there, they talked about it coming up from the earth, like it's there in the soil, or it's almost like a Mother Earth kind of feeling to it. For me personally, I sort of have this feeling of like it's out there in the atmosphere, and somehow it coalesces and comes through a person. Fanny's often talked to me about how, as a human being, you can sort of embody something of what the universe is asking. So, and some people in spirituality talk about, is it coming from me or through me or as me? Like, am I just a part of a greater whole? And these are spiritual questions, and they're lovely to ponder, and there can never possibly be a final word on it, but I just say to people, connect with what's really meaningful to you and what makes you feel come alive, what makes you feel you come alive as a source. And that's probably your right answer. And I think if you're really channeling from a deeper place like that, then that's what, you know, is the difference between a source who does tremendous good in the world and some of the biggest figures in history who've in many ways been incredible sources. They've certainly brought a huge vision to life with many people, but it's been a vision of destruction and harm. But yeah, coming from a more spiritual place is probably part of the answer. But anyway, let's make sure we've got time for Bianca's question. It's nice to finally see you on a call, Bianca, after we've been exchanging messages. But yeah, what's your question? Let's see if we can get through that one.
I highly doubt it, but let's still try to maybe exchange some energy. So yeah, I think like just to like mention like first and foremost, like I definitely am sitting here just like someone else said just now, like boiling with energy just now. So I think this is a sign that this conversation that we're having is something that really resonates with my source. So that's one thing. And that makes me think that as an anecdote, Tom was actually supposed to be our like first choice. And I'm sure Tim doesn't mind that I'm saying that for our East Meets West panel. And now I even know more why I had that intuition, because so much of what we're talking about here, like the yin and the yang behind the source, like so much of it is deep within the Eastern traditions and also it's definitely Chinese philosophy. So the second thing, I think it's not a question, I just wanted to share maybe some energy nuggets. Just the other day, I learned from who just happens to be the speaker for you guys midnight. That's the reason why Tom couldn't make it, but I still think it's worth it to stay up for it. So like we have the speaker who actually studied Chinese traditional medicine for a really long time and also Taoism, and was able to translate it into a framework of leadership and actually organizational evolution. And just the other day, I learned from her that there are actually 6 other archetypes when it comes to the yin and the yang, not just what we typically think about pure yin and pure yang, which is pure yin being Mother Earth and pure yang being Father Sky. Actually, we also have the penetrating yang, the surrendering yang, the ascending yang, and the also receptive surrendering yin, the inclusive yin, and also the leading yin. And I've just found that so inspiring. And there's a part of my just intuition saying that maybe source work is about actually seeing all those currents inside of us and being able to work with all of them, right? And really seeing that wholeness within ourselves. And then whatever emerges from that or through us, whether it being sourced through us or maybe even us being embodied as source, that's a question that I've been very much alive with. So in a way, it's not quite a question. I do have questions, but maybe for the panel next year, East Meets West. Yeah.
Oh, so much there. Fanny, do you want to respond?
Yeah, just yes, thank you. It really resonates what you share. Yeah, and maybe one perspective feels like this when it comes to yin and yang. I think one of like the first things also to realize that like we all usually talk about that the feminine is yang and the masculine, no, the feminine is yin and the masculine is yang. And I think that's so not true. Like as you say, like there's forces within yin and within yang, and like there's such a clear feminine yang, and there's such a clear masculine yin, and these two, like the feminine yang and the masculine yin, are so missing in Western society, and it really breaks my heart. And for both the masculine and the feminine. And this notion of like, and I think you see that a lot in like this self-organized world, that we talk about men, that they need to be more feminine, but I think so much more they need to be more yin masculine, which is just as a and yin masculine men is such I mean, yang masculine men are amazing as well, like we need all of it, but yeah, to get the different polarities flowing together in their kind of truth is just so beautiful, and often very lacking.
Yeah,
perhaps I can just, sorry, I'm just really aware of time, sorry to interrupt you. Bianca.
Or
Thanks for your beautiful sharing, but I think we need to sort of move towards wrapping it up. And one thing I liked was the link you made, Bianca, with Spring Cheng, who it feels to me like the conversation, beautiful conversation today, and what she brings with her work, they're kind of part of the same emergent new understanding about source and things that bridge East and West. So maybe just a few last words, Tom and Fanny.
No, I'm feeling
My interruption was a little bit, I feel a little bit
okay.
awkward about interrupting like this, but just to bring it to a close.
Yeah, no, I'm feeling really complete, and I like the way we've ended with this East meets West, because I think when we're talking about these topics, there's such a fundamental, deep humanity to it, and that's some of what I've loved. You know, working with Hideaki, and Shiro's here as well. I didn't spot him earlier in the call. We've done a lot of deep work in Japan, and there's just, from such different cultures, there's something so fundamentally the same. But yeah, Fanny, do you want to have the final word? But just thank you to everyone for coming.
Yeah, maybe a bit building onto that like a Western perspective that I see is this, that is like in adult development or spiral dynamics, and in a sense, like in reinventing organizations, this thing about going up, about evolving. And actually, if you look at it, the creating feminine is very red, the holding masculine is very amber, the creating masculine is very orange, and the holding feminine is very green. And if you're really being true about this ascend and transcend and include, but even that notion, I think it's really about not putting ourselves above nature, and not like, you know, as humans, which is a really Eastern thing to do, of like, you know, think that we're enlightened and going somewhere, and really, and I think it's really, yeah, to really just stick to like what is making us come alive, and not trying to outsmart or over design nature, but actually surrender and unleash that, unleash all the different energies and the things that make us come alive.
Thank you very much, guys, and thank you all to all the listeners. That was a very rich conversation. The word descend and include somehow comes up from, yeah. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.